So the title of the paper is, Was the Fandango Ever Danced in Early California? Questions and Interpretations. Is this better? Is it?
You have to talk right straight into it. It's not a ball.
Just a
mic,
second.
it's
Here.
a unidirectional. Underneath the
That's
desk
perfect.
screen, it's
You got it.
Can you hear now? Asking the question, was the Fandango ever danced in early California, is not merely an idle and speculative scholarly rumination. The question quivers with issues of race and culture, questioning the relative social and power positions of Spaniard and Mexican identities, not only in New Spain and early California, but in contemporary America. When people go to the annual Santa Barbara Spanish Days Fiesta and other similar events, as they have for decades, and they see people wearing Spanish-style flamenco costumes that were historically never worn here, it brings up issues of race and ethnic issues for the scholar. In fact, such privileging of Spanish identity over Mexican identity is often a blatant attempt to whiten and Europeanize the history of early California to make it more acceptable as a bastion of European culture to white residents who, in their racially segregated and wealthy suburbs and neighborhoods, often celebrate a California that never was. Early boosters of the state of California like Charles Loomis or William J. McCoy, who collected Spanish folk songs to create a Never Never Land, Spanish Arcadia, and changing Mexican salon music, which made up the bulk of this collection, into the title Folk Songs of the Spanish Californians. After the American takeover, those deemed Mexicans were driven into barrios, often without proper sanitary facilities and drinking water, while the descendants of Californio families, who frequently had intermarried into Anglo families, on special days they donned the clothing of their ancestors and danced Spanish folk dances of bygone days in fiesta settings. Loomis describes his idea of life in early California, quote, in the California of the Franciscan missions and the vast ranchos, they lived the happiest, the humanest, the most beautiful life that Caucasians have ever lived anywhere under the sun. It was patriarchal as Abraham and far more hospitable, unquote. In both locales, Native Americans died by the hundreds from disease and mistreatment. As Nubia Flores Forero notes, quote, the ships that came to the New World brought in them a sword, a cross, and many diseases, as well as a great variety of people, each with their own music, instruments, songs, and dances, unquote. These events, like that of Santa Barbara, often celebrate flamenco, a genre that was never performed in early California, the history of which ended with the American takeover in 1849. Only more recently have baile folklorico groups been invited to take part as a nod to Mexican identity. The 2016 Santa Barbara Spanish Days Fiesta website features many images of dancers in Spanish flamenco costumes. This desire to find Spanish origins not only characterizes popular culture, but also mars academic endeavors as well, especially in early 20th century studies. In her collection of Spanish-American folk songs, folklorist Eleanor Haig claims, quote, in California, the better families were very proud of keeping their Castilian blood pure. And yet, in her analysis of the several hundred songs that she and others collected, quote, I have been able to trace only 5 of these melodies back to Spain, unquote. Toward the end of the century, James K. Ledger's review of Donald Robe's Hispanic Folk Music of New Mexico and the Southwest, he states, Rob seems obsessed with proving the ultimate origin of New Mexican Hispanic folk songs in the music of medieval Spain. Thus, he perpetuates the fantasy heritage theory of New Mexican, and I might add Californian, culture the idea that the musical culture of medieval Spain has been preserved relatively intact in the isolated mountains and valleys of New Mexico for over 4 centuries, unquote. The object of all this privileging Spanish origins over Mexican lies in, I would argue, an unstated form of racial prejudice. Historian Carrie McWilliams brings a useful corrective in observing, quote, in the territory that now makes up the United States, Spaniards have always been a negligible ethnic element, unquote. He adds, in the evenings, one or the other of the patios would witness the gathering of the Spanish dons from the rancho, dancing the contradanzas and jotas to the click of the castanets. In the evening, the young ranchero strolled beneath the window of his lover's boudoir. As the moon rose high over the Sierra Madres, he would sing the old love songs of Spain, a very romantic, idyllic, very beautiful. Indeed, it's really a shame that it never existed. Never existed? How can this be said when so much of public life in Los Angeles is based on the assumption that it did? And now the main question. Was the Fandango, a quintessentially Spanish folk dance, danced in Alta California? First, what was the Fandango? The Fandango, I would suggest, constitutes a genre or a complex of dance movements and choreographic characteristics. It is described in many sources as a solo or couple dance performed with castanets. It is a dance genre that is both folkloric and also found in professional contexts like zarzuela, and constitutes an important part of the canon of flamenco songs and dances. It is mentioned in the memoirs of Spanish immigrants in the New World. Several writers have suggested that the Fandango dance and music is the parent of several other forms, such as Malagueñas in Spain and jarocho music in Veracruz, in much the same way as salsa has morphed from mambo and cha-cha. Peter Manuel has characterized the music and dance as, quote, the Fandango set of musical families that remains an unruly and sprawling set of entities, unquote. The dance can be performed in 6/8 and 3/4 meters. Manuel notes that of the set of parameters that characterize Fandango, quote, one of these would distinguish Fandango as a dance genre. The early historical references to Fandango from 1705 on describe it primarily as a dance, unquote. He concludes the category of Fandango, quote, has become an all-encompassing and meaningless category, unquote. As to the dance, quote, the Fandango as such is a dance of obviously Spanish descent, known in the 18th century, if not before, which has spread indefinitely all over Spain up to our own time. The peasant origin of this dance is beyond question, unquote. There are many examples on YouTube from Granada, which I enjoyed watching for several hours. In the same manner as belly dance in the 19th century, the Fandango took on the reputation as a lascivious dance in travelogues and set the scene for sexual tourism with Spain as a destination. As Lou Chernon Deutsch observes, by the time Casanova made his sexual foray into Spain in 1768, a few years later, the Fandango was associated closely with sexual mimicry, which probably boosted its popularity with male tourists. For this presentation, I want to suggest a number of points. According to Spanish dance historian Maria Luisa Herrera Escudero in the book Tipos y Trajes, in which she makes a region-by-region survey of Spain, and in the sections that describe which dances are most popular in each region. Clearly, the Fandango is still prominent throughout most of the southern eastern regions of Spain in the 20th century. Joaquin Garcia, a Spanish student from Andalusia who was resident at my college, told me that the Fandango is still performed in certain regions like Huelva and Malaga. In early California, for example, it is mentioned a few times as a dance event, which eventually came to mean an especially low-class public dance event, and more rarely as a dance. The term baile, dance and dance event, a ball, as the population grew and with it intense differentiation in social class, a ball for which one issued invitations to distinguish it from a fandango, which was a general and public event. During the early California statehood period, Fandango houses came to mean a place of brawling, drinking, and knife fights. But as a dance genre, was it the same dance or even related to the dance known in Spain? Well into the 20th century, descendants of the Californios, by which I mean the Spanish-speaking families, self-designated as gente de razón to distinguish themselves from the Native American groupings, danced several dances that were part of the repertory of dances that their ancestors performed in social settings. Professor Lucille Charnovsky of University of California, Berkeley, collected and notated those dances from among the informants of descendants of California families who were still performing before eager audiences wanting to partake of the real early California well into the 1970s. Fandango is not listed among the dances that Charnovsky collected and notated, although as I observed elsewhere, many of the dances that were performed prior to statehood, especially those requiring elements of improvisation and difficult Zapateado techniques, were not among those that the descendants of the Californios performed when I saw them during the 1960s and 1970s. There were some Spaniards, especially among the most elite, and also among the clergy and the missions. Dancing was one of the most popular activities among them. Several observations indicate that at least for the earlier period, the fandango was danced for a short period at least. Forero notes, quote, the cultural forms that were brought from the peninsula were copied in the colonies. Criollos and mestizos imitated the music and dance from European court ballrooms in order to attain social recognition, unquote. So perhaps there were enough individuals who knew the fandango to perform it in the early 19th century, even in early California, with its relatively few Spaniards. To further complicate this issue, I want to suggest that what might be called a fandango in the place of origin might be a very different dance in the New World and might not be recognizable to people back in Spain. Folk and social dance metamorphoses all over the world so that we can see the mambo become cha-cha and then salsa. And fandango served to morph into large numbers of new genres in the New World. Dances are dynamic phenomena, and dancers, especially in dances that have large improvisational elements, dancers continuously introduce new movements and other choreographic elements. Dances must be thought of as always developing. Escudero notes of the fandango that it is the parent of other dances such as seguidillas and jotas, which derive from fandango. In short, we must look upon the fandango as a dynamic, changing dance tradition and a complex of dances with folkloric, flamenco, and other staged professional genres. A related issue is, when does a dance take on so many changes that it becomes a new dance with a new name, or even the same new dance with an old name? It has been shown that for several reasons, not least of which was California, from both a social and political aspect, was a very poor choice for a highly placed Spaniard to live. Because it was geographically and socially at the end of the Spanish Empire and isolated, and it was without the potential for political or economic gain, very few Spaniards actually ever came to California. If this was the case, how did the fandango come to be danced by an overwhelmingly non-Spaniard social environment? Or perhaps more precisely, was the fandango known throughout much of Spain ever danced in early California? This latter point is extremely important because unlike music, which can be learned by reading a score, dance is a purely folkloric form. Even when learning ballet in a studio, by folkloric, I mean that folklore is learned from face-to-face personal interactions. That is what defines the scholarly field of folklore studies, how folk dance, folk music, and folk tales are learned. In order to learn a dance, one has to learn it from others directly. This means that a critical mass of individuals must be present who know a genre, such as the fandango, before it can be performed, which implies a number of individuals from a particular location need to know the dance and the music to perform and pass it on to others, this specific dance genre, in a new place. In the studies regarding Spanish immigration to the New World, it is clear that thousands of Spaniards came to the New World. They came from a variety of regions, each with its own music and dances. In her study of the immigration patterns to the Spanish possessions of the New World, Rosario Marquez Macias does not even mention California as a port of destination, although she lists in minute detail, all of the destinations in the New World in which Spaniards disembarked, as well as their points of origin. She notes, however, that it would be impossible to know if they stayed in the destination inscribed in their licenses or if they moved to other destinations, which could mean that those Spaniards who came to California left from other destinations like Mexico City. Historian Mark Burkholder details from which class and in which profession Spaniards entered. He notes the office of the viceroy and other well-born individuals, but notes, quote, sailors who jumped the ship may have comprised the most numerous group of peninsulars, unquote, and that, quote, Europeans that reached Spanish America were overwhelmingly male. This was certainly the case for Alta California as well, but like Macias, Burkholder does not mention California in his study. Nevertheless, I uncovered several references to the Fandango as a dance, including an account by a woman who danced in early California. At the time when I came from Loreto to San Diego, I was very fond of dancing and was considered the best dancer in the country. Once Chepo Rodriguez and I danced together at Santa Barbara. Chepo was much lauded as a great dancer. We danced the jarabe, and she got tired and sat down, leaving me still dancing. I also beat another lady who was a famous dancer. A challenge was sent out as far as Monterrey for dancers to come and compete with me, but nobody came. When I was young, I danced everything: sones, jarabes, Puerto Rico, medio 14, fandango, la sorita, las pollitas, and el caballo, unquote. In addition, Harris Newmark in his memoirs noted, quote, only for the first few years after I came was the real fandango so popular when Dana visited Los Angeles and first saw Don Juan Bandini execute the dance witnessed here. Little by little, it went out of fashion, perhaps in part because of the skill required for its performance, unquote. Juan Bandini has been noted in many memoirs. He was very famous for his dancing and has been also mentioned for his stylish clothes. And Dana gives a description of the fandango, which he described, quote, on the part of the women at least, a lifeless affair, but Don Juan Bandini gave us the most graceful dancing I had ever seen, unquote. So I must conclude that the fandango was danced in California, but not for very long. I would suggest that if, as Forero, Montfort, and others suggest, that the fandango morphed into son and jarabe and many other genres, then that may be the path by which everything arrived in California, as McWilliams emphasizes in his book, North from Mexico. Most of the original settlers to Los Angeles, mostly in mestizo combinations of African, Indian, and Spanish, largely from Sinaloa and Sonora. The dances they knew had to have been learned there. The son and jarabe, according to various scholars, are derivative of the fandango. Gabriel Salivar, in his published study, Jarabe, Baile Popular Mexicano, here the jarabe is traced to the Spanish Zapateados found in the 16th century, to the fandango of the same era, and to the sambra, a Moorish dance, unquote. However, in checking the dances that were performed as the Southwest was taken over by Americans, Aurora Lucero White notes, quote, there is nothing in the Spanish colonial dances which would link them with the folk dances of the Iberian Peninsula, unquote. But we know from descriptions that dances featuring Zapateado were popular among Californians in the period before statehood. Excuse me. By my argument, I do not wish to suggest that nothing Spanish was performed in early California. The fathers brought church music, including the whole range of Spanish Renaissance music, according to Ray and Embeck. Musicologist William Sumner agrees, noting that the printed sources, quote, provide clear and tangible evidence for the wholesale translation of Spain's active sacred musical culture to Alta California. And now I shall have to check with you on all of that, if he is correct. But these genres of music are both conservative in that they resist change. Think London Bridges Falling Down and Happy Birthday to You, which in my 80 years of living, these types of game songs and celebratory songs have never changed. In an NEH Summer Scholar Seminar on Latin American music, I analyzed dozens of Spanish folk songs from the collections recorded from descendants of the early Californios, and as Eleanor Haig above, found them to be largely salon music popular in Mexico at that time, with hardly any music with Spanish origins present. I looked at what proportion of the Spanish immigration into each area of the New World and where they settled and how that corresponds to the areas in which the fandango was danced. Elsewhere, I have suggested that because of the ephemeral quality of dance, that in order to transfer the knowledge of dance, one must learn it or teach it in person. Frequently, when people immigrate to a new place, if there are no other individuals from their place of origin, then they cease to perform folk dances and songs that they knew in the old world. Thus, I suggest that in order for individuals to continue to perform dances familiar to them, there must be a critical mass of individuals who know both the music and the dance of their native region in order for them to continue performing it in the new location. That critical mass will differ depending on how many performers are needed to perform a particular genre. In conclusion, from eyewitnesses, it appears that this fandango was performed for a short period of time, which indicates that enough Spaniards and or criollos were present to keep it alive for a short time. Thank you.